checking for empty values. So far, we've seen how to handle multiple types of queries and how to filter. And with filtering, there comes a lot of nuance when it comes to what am I supposed to filter? How am I supposed to filter it? All the data we've filtered so far has been pretty straightforward because all of the values were there. There wasn't a case of us having to deal with empty values. And now you may be thinking, what do you mean by empty values? Well, when we look at data, you can have records that do not have a value, and that is considered empty. So when a record does not have a value, it is considered empty. All right? But what does that mean? Because I haven't seen any empty records in my data. Well, here's the thing. When we talk about empty values, there is one type that reigns supreme under empty. Now, if you've done coding before, you may have heard of it. It's called NULL. And null values are values that are empty. Null is used to represent empty or missing values. So NULL. That is the term we use to represent that missing value. And now null is a special type because null is different from being zero or a field that may contain text and have some spaces in there. Null is special in a way that it does not conform to what you would consider, right? If we have a number, we have a number. And when we have a date, well, we know that the field will contain dates. And then when we have text, we know we can put empty spaces and this and that. And an empty space is a way to kind of mess up your thought process because the field will look empty, but it won't be. So null is that special value that across the board is just used for things that you do not know exist yet, or you may not have a value for. So if you looked at ValentinaDB and you wanted to check for empty values, well, you could do a simple select query. And what you would see here is you would have a customer ID and a first name. And maybe you didn't have everyone's first name. And so here you can see one Mark 2. Oh, wait, we don't know user 2's first name. And so most database software will actually show you this type of syntax when a value is empty. This is to strictly visualize to you that this is a null value, that this does not have a value. Because let's say you had Mark, but Mark was a bit smart and he decided not to fill his name in, but put in a bunch of space bars. And now this shows as a blank space because you saved it that way. Well, then the database software went ahead and denoted what is actually null versus what is kind of a hack. Now, data should never come into your database without being sanitized or checked for correct values. That being said, it could happen. And so it's nice to know that you have this visualization over this. Now, that's something that the database software can do for you, right? It doesn't have to. The database software, when you do a select query, can show you those null values. Let's go over here to dbfiddle. And what I've put together here is a small table with some null values. And just to show you that most tools will catch this null value and visualize it to you, if we press run here, what we will see is that dbfiddle is showing us those null values. Well, the age is not filled in, the last name isn't filled in. Oh, here the first name wasn't filled in. Here, first name and last name wasn't filled in. So we know that the null value is there. But just to show you the difference, if we did this and we put a couple of spaces in here, and then we did a select, well, let's run that back. Oh, name is empty. So an empty string can show up as empty, but null will show up as null. Okay, good to know. So we can now determine what is null versus what is empty. And so the fact that most database software will do this for you out of the box, show you those null values versus an empty value, well, that is very important for you to understand what's going on with your data. But I hear you asking yourself, should I use null? Is it okay for me to have empty data? Is it okay for me to kind of be leaving stuff blank? This is a question every database administrator struggles with. Now, I have 3 things that you need to keep in mind. Be careful, be mindful, and be deliberate. What do I mean here? Well, when I say be careful, what I mean is be very careful with what you make nullable. Don't just make everything nullable, because when you create a table, which we'll get into later in the course, by default, every field is nullable. You can insert null values. So when I say be careful, it goes back to that old saying, always be defensive. You learn this in driving, you learn this in technology. The first thing I learned when I did IT security was turn everything off and turn on only what you need. Well, the same can be said for null. When you create a table, hey, maybe turn everything off, make everything not nullable, and then be very deliberate about what you want to be nullable. The second one is be mindful. Whatever you turn into null may have effects on queries that other people will write. So maybe don't make fields nullable that you have to do calculations on. Or don't make fields nullable that are vital information to the business, like first and last name. You need to know who you're shipping an order to. So be mindful of what you're making nullable, because you might not be able to catch these things later on, and they might unravel for your colleagues having to look into it. So work as a team and be mindful of what you're making nullable. And then be deliberate. What do I mean by be deliberate? Make a choice and stick to it. Document it. Make it clear that that field, that particular record of data is going to be nullable. And make a design doc. Make a document outlining why it's nullable and why you made that choice. Always be careful, mindful, and deliberate when using null, because it is hard for other people to understand what you are doing when you make things nullable. So just keep those things in mind. Now, null is a contentious issue. No matter what opinion you have, people may disagree with you. I've met database administrators that like to keep things nullable, and I've met some that like to make things as strict as possible. No nulls ever. And there are people in the middle that are more pragmatic, that are like, well, we got to make the right decisions here. I fall into the middle group. When you make a decision, make sure you document why you're doing it. Make sure you talk to the team about it. Just make sure that it is known why you're doing this. Because it is a contentious issue. It can cause bugs. It does cause bugs. Null causes bugs all the time. I can't tell you the amount of times I've written software where I've had to catch these null cases from a database coming up, or the other way around. It causes chokes along the software development lifecycle. You may not have an adverse effect from making something nullable, but once someone consumes your database to build an app, a website, or any other thing, well, null may come into play, and it may cause bugs, issues, hard times being able to handle the data. For instance, if you made first and last name nullable, well, now your end developers need to be able to catch that, oh, first name and last name may not come back even after a user is created. So let's just say you had an app, and users use that app to interact with your system. And you have the website, and users use that same thing to interact with whatever you're building. Let's say it's YouTube or whatever. And from the website, you can register, and from the app, you can register. But on the website, there's a bug, and suddenly people can register without having a first name. And then they log into the app, and the app didn't catch that the first name can be nullable, but they got through the register process without a first name. Well, now your app may break. That is why null can be one of those contentious issues. That's why it can be one of those things where, okay, when we're going to do it, we need to be deliberate. We need to be mindful. Just make sure that everyone knows what is, what isn't, and why. The why matters. Null is also a special value. You see over here, 1 is equal to 1 will yield true. and 1 not equal to 1 will yield false. But null equal to null will output null, and null different than null will output null. Let's look at that. So over here, we're in Valentina. And you can see that I did select null equal to null. Well, let's run that. So when we execute that, what we can see is it's outputting null as a value. And now I want to show you what I mean by that. Why it's special. Why is it outputting null? Well, if we uncomment select 1 equal to 1, what you're going to see is it's returning true. Huh. Interesting. Okay. That makes sense. So null is going to return null. So null is a special value. Null will return null. Now, what does that mean? What effect does that have? Well, all roads lead to null. No matter what you do with null, it will always be null. If you subtract, if you divide, if you do equal, if you try to do something with a null value that we've learned, if you have null values and you're trying to do an average, for instance, you're going to get back null. Null can be one of those nasty side effects. So that's why, again, you have to be mindful, be careful, be deliberate, be clear what is going to be null, because when you start doing these things, it may cause issues. Again, no matter what you do with null, it is always going to return you null, and you only need one null value. You could do a complex calculation of 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 divided by, and so forth and so on. And if you divide it by null, well, you're going to get null back. And it's going to be hard for you to trace down which value is null and why it's null and who didn't fill it in. So you may be asking yourself now, how should we use null? Well, let's look into that.